One of the greatest controversies surrounding the Korean War was President Truman's decision to relieve General Douglas MacArthur of his position within the United States Army. This conflict impacted the Korean War because of President Truman's choice to fire MacArthur. By doing so, the United States would not face any further conflicts with other countries, and there would be a peaceful compromise between South Korea and America. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950, when 75,000 North Korean soldiers invaded the Republic of South Korea. In 1945, Korea was split along the 38th parallel. Throughout the war, North Korea was aided by China and the Soviet Union. This caused issues for the U.S. because they were allies with South Korea, and both China and the Soviet Union posed as a threat. President Truman announced a speech to the United States about the events occurring in Korea. He made sure the worldwide events that were occurring were addressed in our country and that we needed to keep ourselves alert.
Small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. On Sunday, June 25th, communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. Free nations must be on their guard, more than ever before, against this kind of sneak attack. We are united in detesting communist slavery. We know that the cost of freedom is high, but we are determined to preserve our freedom no matter what the cost.
On July 19th of 1950, President Truman officially announced to the United States that our country would be entering the war.
My fellow citizens, at noon today, I sent a message to the Congress about the situation in Korea. We have sent land, sea, and air forces to assist in these operations. We have done this because we know that what is at stake here is nothing less than our national security and the peace of the world.
With the U.S. aiding Korea in the war, General Douglas MacArthur made most of the decisions concerning the troops that would go to South Korea. MacArthur's choices for his soldiers had to be consulted by the president, and even though President Truman and General MacArthur agreed most of the time on the actions the U.S. Army would take, a conflict in one of the decisions made ended up with a large consequence for MacArthur. General MacArthur had decided to make a decision without having the approval of the government. He thought that his idea of crossing the Yalu River to bomb China would help the war, although it only ended up with him getting fired from his position. The United States had a discussion whether the UN forces should advance north of the 38th parallel in order to occupy North Korea. President Truman went through with it, although he knew that this decision might cause the Soviet Union or China to enter the war. The decisions made by MacArthur caused Mao Zedong, the chairman of the Communist Party in China, to threaten the U.S. on October 3, 1950, announcing that if they cross the parallel, the Chinese will enter the war. U.S. officials highly doubted that the Chinese would follow through because they believed they would never attack U.S. troops while in Korea. Even with this belief, General MacArthur still wanted to gather his soldiers to cross the Yalu River. He knew that China's involvement could cause a major conflict for the U.S. and thought that bombing them would stop the war. President Truman made a compromise with General MacArthur that ended up with the troops advancing north of the 30th parallel, although they would not go farther. On October 9, 1950, China had assembled 4 armies and 3 divisions across the Yalu River that bordered between China and North Korea. Well aware of the troops, the UN forces continued moving across the border. That day, the UN forces entered near Pyongyang, and the Chinese were concerned of how close they were to the Yalu River. The Chinese then decided to send their armies across and up the river, and the opposition leader in Britain, Winston Churchill, claimed his idea that the UN troops should stop advancing 100 miles or more south of the Yalu River and 100 miles wide. MacArthur dismissed this idea because he wanted the troops to keep going. General MacArthur aimed for the 400-mile-wide mark, and that sent the U.S. and Korean troops towards the river. This decision that General MacArthur made went against the orders that came directly from the Pentagon. Only Korean troops were supposed to advance, although General MacArthur decided to do it his own way in hopes of still carrying out his plan. After the troops arrived on the 25th of October, the fighting caused the Chinese troops to retreat. After hearing of the Chinese retreat to the mountains, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, gave the Chinese aircrafts in order to cross the Yalu River. The air coverage provided by Stalin caused the Chinese to invade Korea. The constant fighting between China and the UN created a battle that lasted from November 25th to December 2nd. This conflict caused China to officially enter the war. After the Chinese entered the war, with the help and aid of the Soviet Union, President Truman had discussed the Korean War address.
Homes, our nation, all the things we believe in are in great danger. This danger has been created by the rulers of the Soviet Union. The future of civilization depends on what we do now, and in the months ahead.
Talk about nuclear weaponry was about, and President Truman admitted that if necessary, he would use them. This led to Clement Attlee, Britain's Prime Minister, to talk to Truman about avoiding a new conflict with the Chinese. President Truman attempted to compromise with China and asked them if they wanted to be a part of the UN. The Chinese instead replied that they would only retreat if all of the U.S. troops left. The U.S. troops then decided to retreat, and this caused the Chinese to advance past the 38th parallel into South Korea. Any refugees attempting to flee from the country had no way of getting out because of the U.S. troops. The United States had come to believe that taking more severe actions would be necessary. Most of the people in the U.S. had blamed the Chinese invasion on General MacArthur for disobeying his commands when he continued to advance his troops. After gaining a lot of territory in South Korea, the Chinese soldiers' actions had a major downfall when General Matthew Ridgway, the new commander for the UN, took control. MacArthur had a strong passion of his own for wanting to win the war entirely, so he once again brought up his idea to bomb China. MacArthur wanted to come forward to the U.S. with his idea, although in order to have peace between the U.S. and China, President Truman made his own compromise and fired MacArthur. When MacArthur got fired, the soldiers' actions remained the same under the new command of General Matthew Ridgway. MacArthur's absence in leading impacted the war by bringing compromise to the conflict he wanted to start. President Truman had continued with his plans of aiding South Korea, and after a year and a half, the Korean War ended. When the war ended, President Eisenhower, who took office a few months before the war ended, announced a speech when the war was finally over.
My fellow citizens, tonight we greet, with prayers of thanksgiving, the official news that an armistice was signed almost an hour ago in Korea. It will quickly bring to an end the fighting between the United Nations forces and the communist armies.
President Eisenhower went on to explain the actions of the soldiers that fought in the war.
We salute particularly the valorous armies of the Republic of Korea, for they have done even more than prove their right to freedom. Inspired by President Syngman Rhee, they have given an example of courage and patriotism.
The conflict between President Truman and General Douglas MacArthur impacted our society because of its effects in the Korean War. The Korean War did not turn into an even bigger conflict because of the compromise President Truman made when he stopped General MacArthur from bombing China. As a result of the war that ended after the conflict between Truman and MacArthur, some effects after the war would include North Korea's isolation from other countries. After the war, North Korea made it so no one could get into the country and no one could get out. There were now strict rules that won't allow people to cross the 38th parallel. This separated families that were in North and South Korea, although the laws were enforced to keep everyone safe. When the Korean War ended, South Korea was once again officially free to be its own country with its own government. The compromise between Truman and MacArthur that helped to prevent further conflicts in the war also influenced the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was fought because of the retaliation against communism in North Vietnam. People in Vietnam wanted to reunite their country. The idea of taking back the land and standing against communism came from the Americans' involvement in the Korean War, which evidently began with Truman when he entered the war and his discussions with MacArthur about communism and how to handle it. Throughout the Korean War, numerous conflicts arose, although there was eventually a compromise to each and every one. The conflict between President Truman and General Douglas MacArthur was one of the most important events throughout the Korean War. This is because the conflict between them lasted for months and ended up with a compromise that impacted the end of the war entirely. When President Truman chose to fire General MacArthur, he chose to end his current conflict in order to bring compromise to another country.